she created and co-hosted She and Her, which is a podcast and radio show about millennial feminism in the South. And she started her radio career in the production department of StoryCorps, which is a nonprofit oral history project that interviews everyday people around the country and broadcasts edited versions of those conversations on NPR's Morning Edition. Anita was born in a small coal mining town in Northeast England, but spent most of her life growing up in Iowa and has a fond affection for the Midwest. When she's not making radio, she enjoys playing with her wiry terrier, Oliver, hiking and traveling with her partner, and being an aunt and perfecting the art of an at-home workout. Anita is not only a skilled audio storyteller, radio host, and journalist, but a wonderful person and a mentor of mine. And she's taught me how to turn simple ideas into nuanced audio stories and explore topics outside of my comfort zone in innovative ways. So I'm so excited to have her here to speak to you all today and share her wisdom. So I hope everyone will give me join me in giving her a warm welcome. Thank you so much for being here, Anita.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Lucy. Thanks everyone for joining. Really happy to have y'all here on this Saturday. It is sunny and foggy in Durham. So it was like a good time to come inside. The clouds were coming over. So happy to hang with y'all this afternoon. So I'd love for this to be interactive. I have some interactive things kind of speckled throughout. We'll definitely leave time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to chat things during to each other or things you want me to answer. I'll kind of be bopping in and out of there. And I am going to share my screen and share audio. So just obviously flag me in the chat if at any point something is not working or you can't hear something. Definitely let me know. So what I'm kind of hoping for today is that I will share some of my story, a little bit about my journey and experience in radio and podcasting. I will share a bit about what I have learned about having uncomfortable conversations, some of my experience having uncomfortable conversations, and then provide some opportunities for us to kind of workshop what it means to have an uncomfortable conversation. How can you go into one feeling more prepared, feeling less uncomfortable, and give you all some fodder to think about for both your personal and professional life. This is a topic that I obviously think about a lot for my professional life, but I think there's a lot of bleed over into just how we exist in the world and how we can be better friends and partners and community members and have some of these conversations in a better way. So a little bit about me, just to kind of piggyback off of my bio. I've been living in Durham, North Carolina for the past 7 years and working for North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, which is a public radio station based in the Triangle area. Before then, I was working at StoryCorps. Some of you all may have learned a little bit about StoryCorps earlier today if you did the interviewing workshop, a nonprofit oral history project that travels the country, records the stories of everyday people, and turns those live or those recorded interviews into segments for the radio. And then before that, I was a student at UNC Chapel Hill, where I studied women's studies and international studies and took journalism classes. But it was really my experience in women's studies that informed a lot of my approach to the work that I do today, and especially my approach to the conversations that I have on Embodied. So before I dive too deep into Embodied and the kinds of uncomfy combos, I just wanted to kind of give you all a little bit of a flavor by sharing the trailer. So Embodied is a live weekly radio show on Fridays that I host. We also have a seasonal podcast. So we kind of take the best of the live radio show and create a podcast from those. So the second season just started coming out this past Wednesday. But this is the trailer for the first season. And I will play this for y'all.
There is stuff we are never supposed to talk about.
There are some women who never experience orgasm and can experience massive sexual pleasure. There are some days when orgasm is just too much work.
Conversations that make us feel embarrassed or uncomfortable.
When I started in perimenopausal kind of phase of life, no one was having conversations with me. And unfortunately, at that time, my mother was already deceased. And so I couldn't like tap into her and say, hey, mommy, I'm pregnant and I'm 41. Is this what I should expect?
But the stuff we're not supposed to talk about with each other, like intimacy and our bodies, talking about it more could help us all have a little more empathy for one another.
So that is a bit of flavor of the Embodied podcast. So to tell you a little bit more about how I got into that kind of work, and the origin story of all of this, why I wanted to have uncomfortable conversations in the first place. So I started my public radio career mostly in North Carolina when I moved back down here in 2014, and I was working for a statewide midday talk show, and it talked about everything from state politics to news, arts and culture. We had musicians on, artists on, and for the first 4 years of my career, I was very much behind the scenes, working as a producer, helping to find guests, researching, helping put a live radio show together. And then the host, who was a 65-year-old white man who'd been doing the show for about 20 years, decided he wanted to start taking extended summer vacations. So he was like, do you want to host? You started doing your own podcast. I think you know how to do radio. Would you be interested in hosting? And I definitely never thought of myself. I knew that I loved interviewing, and it felt really good and I really enjoyed it, but I never saw myself being behind the microphone. And I think that's something you tend to hear from a lot of women who end up in radio. We don't often see ourselves in the hosting chair because we don't have a lot of models. We do more so now. But I've kind of done some research digging into the hosts of especially statewide public radio shows around the country. And there are very few hosts that are not older white men still. So not a ton of representations, not a ton of models. Wasn't super comfortable for me to jump into that role, but I decided to do it. And I kind of gave myself the challenge that if I was going to do this, if I was going to sit behind the microphone, like, why not just kind of go all in and talk about topics that I really wanted to talk about. And so throughout my career in public radio, I had started to notice that there were kind of these buckets of topics that I didn't feel like were getting much airtime. And those really revolved around kind of three themes that came to become the focus of Embodied, which were sex, relationships, and health. These things that we were talking about in public radio only from like a very removed, very analytical, very heady perspective. And when I started hosting was 29, I believe, or 28 maybe. And I was realizing that a lot of the conversations that my friends and I were having in our own lives, the things that we were hearing a lot in some of the podcasts we were starting to listen to, were really not reflected on kind of public radio. So I challenged myself to merge those two things. And I started hosting in the summer of 2019. And I launched Embodied as a series during the first summer that I was hosting. And it was very well received by, well, okay, so I guess this is the hard thing, is that you never really know how well received something is, because the loudest voices are usually those that feel some very extreme way. So either very positively or very negatively. So we got a lot of pretty strong feedback from both ends. I got a lot of criticism about my voice, the sound of my voice, the tenor of my voice. I started this whole folder in my inbox that was really just about my voice, just kind of to keep track for my own, edification and to just really think about and have fodder for a conversation. And all of it eventually led to me actually writing. I wrote a piece for the Huffington Post before Embodied the show launched, really about kind of claiming my voice as someone in radio, because what you will hear from a lot of folks in podcasting and in radio is that you get a ton of criticism about the sound of your voice, whether it's for vocal fry, whether it's for verbal tics that you have, but talking in the way that you talk with your friends and your loved ones, which is really the way to sound most comfortable and to sound best on the radio and to sound best in podcasting, means that you will have vocal affectations that folks who were raised think really only hearing older white men with low, deep voices and minimal pause words and no vocal fry are really uncomfortable with. So that has been a big part of my journey, is really owning my voice and standing behind and really speaking out against vocal criticism and working with other women and women identified folks in the radio and podcasting sphere to kind of push back against this, because it is a pretty constant battle. This American Life has done some interesting shows about it. I'm sure y'all have heard people talk about vocal fry before, but despite the fact that more people are talking about it, it's still something that comes up every time a new, younger sounding voice gets on the air. So that's been a big part of my journey in dealing with just the discomfort of how people think about my voice on the air, and learning to really embrace that. And happy to talk more about that later on. But before I get too deep into the specific topics on Embodied, I wanted to get you all thinking a little bit about what topics feel most uncomfortable to talk about. So I'm going to share I'm going to share a link to Padlet here. I'll just put it in the chat. And I just want to take about 2 to 3 minutes and have you all brainstorm some topics that feel uncomfortable. So if you've never used Padlet before, I'm very new to it, but essentially you just click an add button here, and then you add your answer, and then they'll keep going down in the column folder. So let's take 2 to 3 minutes here and just have a little bit of brainstorm, and then I'll be back with y'all at about 2:20. I'll share some tunes while we are chatting. Okay, these are awesome. So many good ones on here. So many that we've talked about on Embodied, which makes me happy. So yeah, mental health, certainly self-harm, medication, stigma, any kind of embarrassing moments, talking about failures, unproductive time, things that are not intellectual, exploring female pleasure. Certainly, we have certainly talked about that. Cunnilingus, love it. Yep. Trauma, suicide, race, not talking over marginalized people when I'm interviewing them, cancel culture, queerness, addiction, guns, death, grieving, yep. Family secrets and repercussions of speaking openly. I love that. Personal questions about family, not having a kid, yep. Race, diet culture. Love it, love it. Okay, we're gonna keep returning to these questions and talking about why these things are uncomfortable and what can make them more uncomfortable and when they are more or less uncomfortable, depending on who we're talking to, the environment we're talking to folks in, all of that. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing all of those. So a bit about sex, relationships, and health in particular. Here's a little clip of the Huffington Post article I was referencing. So as I said, I was a women's studies major, and that has informed a lot of my thinking around this show, and what things we deem as fit for the public realm and which things we deem as not fit. And one of the most interesting aspects of criticism that I have gotten in doing Embodied, especially the live show on the radio, is people saying to me, why are you talking about this at noon? So the show that I host is noon on Fridays, and people really saying like, that's fine if you all want to have a radio show that talks about sex, but it really shouldn't be at noon. That's very inappropriate. And so I kind of took that criticism and made that the central premise of this piece that I wrote about why I want to talk about these topics at noon. And that's very intentional on my part, which is basically that I feel like the idea that these are topics that we should only talk about in the dark of night when only certain people are listening really plays into the idea that these things are not fit for public discourse. These things should be kept out of the public realm. These things are private. These things are maybe shameful. And that is exactly what I'm trying to push against in this show. I'm really trying to say that the longer we keep these conversations about sex, relationship, and health in the realm of not for public discourse, the longer we're going to really stay locked into these very singular narratives about what these topics mean that keep us from knowing ourselves and knowing each other more deeply, connecting with different parts of our own identity, being open to exploring our own pleasure, our own ways that we live outside of the boundaries, and our own ability to have meaningful dialogue that could integrate our own identity and other people's. So this has been something that I've really worked hard to make a central point of this show, which is to say that every time that we talk about a topic like female pleasure on the radio at noon on Friday, it's very intentional. This is an uncomfortable topic. For some folks, that's uncomfortable because talking about sex is uncomfortable. Talking about pleasure is uncomfortable. Talking about it in public is uncomfortable. There are many reasons why that feels uncomfortable. So kind of taking that head on as the premise of the show and diving deeply into that. And so what that means for me as a host and for us as producers is we really have to think about the narrative elements of this. What makes a narrative about an uncomfortable topic compelling? It has a lot to do with the frame, how specific you are in the frame and how clear you are in the frame. It has a lot to do with the host, how you ask questions, how you engage, how empathetic, how curious, how sensitive, how willing to admit your mistakes you are, and has a lot to do with who's telling the story and why are they the voices telling the story. So with a radio show, we think a lot about that for who's going to be on live. Obviously, live radio shows are a very particular kind of beast. You can only control so much. With the podcast, we have a little bit more control. We take all of the content that is on the live radio and we edit that down into a 20 to 30 minute podcast. So with that, we've had a lot of opportunities to really find the narrative, think about what that narrative thread is. And I want to talk about that a little bit now. So finding the narrative, what that has meant for me and what that has meant for this show. So the challenge with any narrative podcast is really identifying and personifying the narrator. And this picture that you see on the left is my parents. And that is because a big part of finding the narrative for Embodied for me was thinking about why I was the one having these conversations. I had a conversation with Anna Sale, who some of you may know. She's a host of Death, Sex, and Money, and she's one of my favorite interviewers. And she said something to me that really shaped how I approached my process, which was, why are you the one telling the story? Why are you the one having these conversations? And the more that I thought about it, the more that I thought about that, the more that I realized that I actually had to, if I was asking everyone else to get uncomfortable, I needed to make myself uncomfortable. And while having the conversations can be an intellectual challenge, it doesn't always feel uncomfortable to me because I'm well prepared. I've thought a lot about this. So how can I actually really get uncomfortable? And that for me was talking to my parents. So for the podcast, in every episode, there is a section in which I talk to my parents about the theme at hand. So whether that is porn or pleasure or abortion or whatever the topic may be, I challenged myself to have conversations about topics with my parents that we've a lot of times never talked about before and never talked about personally. And so putting myself in the story and kind of asking myself to get uncomfortable has been a big part of my own learning journey. And I think a big, something that's really important for a podcast host to consider is, why is your listener, if you are the vehicle through which they're listening to this narrative and learning this story, how are you earning their trust? How are you credible? And for me, that was kind of putting myself in the shoes of the folks that I was asking on and really putting myself in the story. So that was kind of part one of finding the narrative, was figuring out my own narrative role and my own individual discomforts. And then conversational scripting. I'm not going to get too much into this because I think there are other workshops and conversations today about scripting. But especially when it comes to podcasting, the script is really key for thinking about how to guide the listener through the journey. So I think conversational scripting is really the way to go, not sounding overly, especially for this style of show where I'm trying to form a relationship with the listener and talk about things that are uncomfortable, is really trying to make as much of it sound like a conversation that I would actually have, or be words that I would actually say in the way that I would say them. So when I am tracking for the podcast, one of the things that I do is I read over what's on the page, and then I close my eyes and I try to just say it as if I would be saying it if I were talking to someone, and trying to read off the page as little as possible, or reading one or two sentences and then closing my eyes and saying them and realizing the words are sometimes different. The flow is a little bit different than how it would be when read exactly off the page. And then the kind of classic storytelling training, more telling, less showing. And this is a journey with every episode. The picture that you see here is Morgan Gibbons. They are a podcast host themselves, formerly a producer for 1A. And they were part of an episode that we did on the experience of trans folks seeking healthcare. And it was a really wonderful episode. It had a lot of really interesting elements, but it was a lot of telling, not a ton of showing. Didn't have any really strong, compelling narratives. And Morgan's story about finding affirming healthcare for the first time in his 20s when he was in DC, and really building a relationship with his provider. That was really what made the narrative and made this whole kind of topic that was challenging people's views on their bodies, on healthcare, come together, because it really needed that narrative component. So I want to play you a little bit now so this is a video trailer that we just released about a week ago in anticipation of our second season of the Embodied podcast, which launched this week. And it kind of tells you a little bit more about how I have tried to think about my role as a host and make myself vulnerable, and how this season has changed a little bit as a result of the pandemic. So here's that video.
Ever since I've been hosting Embodied, I walk around all day with voices in my head.
I can kind of just like drag hands out. Sex like doesn't make sense. So it's kind of funny how people, when I do end up disclosing my status to them, the reactions of like, oh, so that's why.
These voices make me think about who I am, how I navigate the world.
All of us that live long enough will know what it means to live through a disabled body.
And they're good company to have at times when I have to work extra hard just to feel normal.
Anita, people are really jerking off 24/7, especially during the pandemic, and they're not going to stop anytime soon.
I know I'm going to live with these voices for a long time, and I love that.
So there's the famous Oliver, the wiry terrier that Lucy told you about earlier, who I love hanging out with. He's pretty cute. Okay, so I'm going to go through some examples of conversations I've had on the show in a little bit. But first, I want to hear a bit from y'all about, as you're continuing to think and reflect on some of those topics that you shared already, what makes a conversation uncomfortable? So we'll go back into that same Padlet. I will reshare the link here. And give you all a couple minutes to answer that question. Oh, sorry, I didn't share that with everyone. There you go.
Baby, till the rising of the sun.
Sorry, I didn't add a new. Just added a new panel in there for the Padlet. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so many good things in here. Let's talk through some of them. All right, folks said people's judgment, one's own upbringing and background, especially if you've never talked about something, they need to feel perfect. Fear of re-traumatizing someone, that's huge. We're going to get to that. Person's reaction, if it's not an easy emotion, and shame. Not wanting to offend others or expose yourself, that's huge. Wanting to be empathetic, but knowing you don't share the same experience, for sure. Fear that we're the only one experiencing it. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of not being heard. The idea that you are the one with the power, that's great. Power dynamics, yep. Knowing how you think or feel, discovering as you speak. I love that. Awesome. Those are great. So I think what comes through in a lot of those is the idea that there are so many things. Sometimes it can be the relationship. It can be that it's hard to talk with this topic with this person in particular because of the nature of your relationship, whether it's a power dynamic, whether it's past history, whether there's just some uncomfortable stakes there. It can be the topic itself, topics that we're not used to talking about, topics that we've been taught we're not supposed to talk about. It can be the setting, whether an interview setting itself makes it uncomfortable, or it's a family reunion, or the setting, something about the setting makes it uncomfortable. And I think what's important to remember is that some of these things are in your control and some of them aren't in any given situation. So when you're thinking about having uncomfortable conversations as an interviewer or for a podcast or for a project, what I want to encourage you to do is to minimize and try to confront, I guess not minimize, to try to confront all of those things that are in your control and try to release those that aren't and prepare yourself for both. So what that means for me personally, and what this meant for our show, is building a code of conduct, being very specific, being very intentional, and really thinking through the why. So I think one of the most important things to do before having a hard conversation is to set the table, both for you and for the other person, whether that's in your personal life or whether that's for the purposes of a podcast. Getting your guest or interviewee to understand why you want to have this conversation. What is your intention? And it should be something more than just because it's for my show or because it's for my podcast. It should have more depth. It should have more thought to it than that. So some of the things that we have put together, this kind of code of conduct that you see here for Embodied, this is not everything, but these are some highlights, is thinking about what are some of the reasons that we want to have these conversations. Is we want to give people, especially people who are talking about topics that are often seen as uncomfortable or marginalized, the opportunity to answer questions that they want to answer, to talk about sides of their experience or aspects of their experience that they don't get asked about. So instead of having the same conversations about these topics or asking the same interviewer, voyeuristic, kind of outsider looking in questions that you may always get when you talk about an uncomfortable topic. Give them a platform and an opportunity to think about what are the questions that they actually want to answer. So that's something we talk about in the preparation process is we, when we reach out to guests, when we do pre-interviews, we talk to them about what are the things that they actually, if they had a platform to share anything, what would they want to say? And starting from there, asking about personal experiences and values instead of asking people to speak for entire groups that they are a part of. This is a huge pitfall that you can fall into as an interviewer, as a podcaster, when you're interested in these big themes, is unintentionally making people speak outside of their own experience. So the more that you're really honing in on their narrative and letting their narrative weave through these themes that you're interested in versus laying themes on them and asking them to speak on behalf of groups that they're not a part of. Anticipating diversity instead of accommodating for it. So for us, what that really means is not assuming that our audience is any one thing. So we don't want to assume that a listener is, a white man who doesn't ever think about pleasure and this conversation is going to really catch him off guard. We want to assume that our listener is someone who may identify with the experiences of the people that we are sharing the stories of, and they feel really seen and heard because this narrative is shared. So anticipate and prepare for a diversity of experiences and create a platform for that instead of trying to make people explain themselves in a way that would make sense to an assumed viewer or listener, older white man, even though those are probably the majority of public radio listeners. That's not what we go into it believing and thinking. Expanding the definition of an expert. I think this is one of the most powerful things that podcasting can do, that public radio can do when it's at its best, but it takes a lot of effort, is to not think about experts as people with PhDs, masters, any kind of qualifications behind their name. Think about people as experts because they have lived the experience. So expanding the definition of what an expert is has been a huge part of what we have done on Embodied, is really trying to limit having people speak because they've done a lot of research, but people speak instead because they've lived a lot and want to talk about the things that they have lived and been through. Don't over-explain your premise. I think that this is something that a lot of podcasters, especially new podcasters, it's an easy trap to fall into, is because you really want to bring people on the journey with you. And so you spend a lot of time thinking about what your premise is and how you're going to really make that come through. And I think that can create an unnecessary boundary between the listener and the subject matter, or the listener and the interviewees, because it assumes that they don't have a connection with what the premise is, or that they really need you to walk them through that. So I think that's something to try to avoid. Not trying to be too cute or clever. And so when we say in podcasting, like, write how you talk, I think a lot of that is helping you to avoid those overly cute, overly clever use of too many metaphors and euphemism kind of thing in scripting that can tend to happen when you try to sound like something you've heard versus just being yourself. And assume your listener is smarter than you. I think it's a great way to get a great intention to go into creative work, assuming that your listeners are smarter than you and you're not trying to over-explain things, or you're not trying to be didactic in what you're doing. You're trying to tell beautiful stories and be creative and be experimental. So I think building a code of conduct for yourself as an interviewer for your show, for your project, especially if you're talking about sensitive and uncomfortable things, is really important, as something to keep coming back to, as a reminder of why you're doing this work. As I wouldn't necessarily send this to guests, because it can, I don't know, I guess depending on the guest, maybe some people would enjoy seeing that, but I would use this more as a guidepost for yourself and your work. What is your code of conduct? Why are you doing this work? How do you want to set the table? Why are you having these conversations? And thinking through that with a lot of depth before you dive into a project, especially if it's about difficult topics. So I'm going to give a couple of examples now of some of the conversations that we have had on the show, and we'll have some time to unpack these in breakout groups in a little bit. So as you're listening, I want you to think about what struck you about what the guests said and what they didn't say. So what was left out, what was missing, what struck you about the hosting, the questions I asked or how I asked them, what do you feel like worked well? What could I have done differently? And we'll go through a couple of different examples. So this is Shine Louise Houston, and Shine is an adult filmmaker based in Los Angeles and the founding director of Pink and White Productions, which is a production company creating queer pornography. And Shine was one of the guests for our show about porn and pleasure. And so one of the things about the process of Embodied and the process of creating the show and the process of having hard conversations in general that I really want to emphasize is preparation. Preparing as a host, preparing as a producer. I think pre-interviews are so important, which is basically someone, I think not the host, ideally, someone else calling them up, getting a chance to talk with them, really learning how they talk, what really lights them up, what areas are sticky, what terrain do they not want to go into, do they use a lot of jargon, do they tell stories in kind of a roundabout way, are they a very fast talker, are they a very slow talker, getting all of those things, learning the rhythm of how people talk, I think is very important for radio and podcasting work, as well as, and the prep process, it's also really important. So, you can prepare yourself as a host or an interviewer for what spots are going to be tricky. So in this show, I was prepped to know that Shine was a really good talker, had a very compelling story, had a lot of really compelling reasons why she got into this work, reasons why she films in the way that she does. But I was also prepped to know that she does not like the term ethical pornography, which was one of the things that we are exploring in the show, which is that, is it possible to do porn, to create porn in a way that is ethical? Is there ethical porn and non-ethical porn? And for the purpose of the show, I was playing the role of bridging our listeners who maybe don't even want to talk about porn at all, are so uncomfortable with the topic, to our guests who are so steeped in this world, have very complicated thoughts. And so I was kind of prepped to know that if I asked a question about ethical porn, Shine was going to either get on a soapbox or be a little bit prickly. So here is a bit of that conversation.
So I would love for you to talk about this notion of ethical pornography and what it means to you. What does it mean to you to kind of create porn that is based on a particular kind of ethical standard?
Okay. To start off, I have my soapbox about the term ethical porn. I feel like it really polarizes the industry. To say that some people are ethical implies that the rest of the industry is unethical. And, that throws a lot of really awesome people under the bus. And I don't feel comfortable with that. The industry is not a monolith. The industry is incredibly diverse, but I don't want to put too much weight on these labels.
So when you got into the industry, I'd love to know about kind of what your intentions are as a creator. Like, what is the kind of content that you're hoping to create?
When I started with the original movie, like The Crash Pad, I had been working at Good Vibrations. And what I was seeing was, like a lot of queer folks were coming in and being like, hey, what can I watch that kind of looks representative of my community? And at the time, there weren't terribly many titles with that type of representation. So I decided to go ahead and jump in right off the bat. Several things are important, important of like different body representations, different gender expression, and I wanted to be sustainable. I didn't want to be like everybody else who like did one title, two titles, and like disappeared. I was like, we need something that's like consistent, something that's just as consistent as, lesbian MILFs 1 through 257. Do you know what I mean?
Well, but talk about that, because there is this concern that people have that there is porn out there that they perceive as degrading to the performers, degrading to the viewers. So how do you set up an environment with the people that you're working with to make sure that the things that they're creating are things that they are comfortable with, and things that make them feel safe?
Okay, so that's kind of pointed, assuming that a lot of stuff out there is already totally degrading. I think what people forget is that there's actually a lot of discussion about what's about to happen on set and how it's going to happen, and the performers do a lot of negotiation. And I'm talking about more mainstream stuff, like stuff that's, it doesn't even matter if it's like cream pies or like circle jerks or anything like that. Everybody has talked about what's happening. And, you might find that action degrading, but there are some people who are like, wow, that was like my biggest fantasy. That was awesome. And it might not be my style of shooting, or it might not be like my fantasy, but just to put it out there, but just because some things are for the particular viewer hard to watch, or like, I'm not too sure if I'm into that, I'm not going to necessarily label that degrading.
Okay. So there is Shine, and I'm going to put the Padlet link here again. And so as I talk through these next couple of examples, I want you to start thinking about and jotting down notes about what struck you, about what the guest said and how they said it, what worked well and what didn't in these various conversations. So there are a couple columns in there, and you can start thinking through some of that as I share a couple of more examples to give a little bit more fodder. All right. So my goal with these samples is to kind of give you 3 examples of conversations that were challenging for different reasons. So for this one, for me, was challenging because Shine was very opinionated, and I knew that going in, and I knew that there were going to be prickly spots going in, but I also knew that my intention behind this show, and that kind of goes back to the frame and setting the table, was to find a way to have a conversation about porn that didn't fall into the traps that I feel like a lot of media narratives around porn do, which is overly focusing on porn addiction, which is focusing on porn as seen by this very particular gaze, and as trying to kind of like normalize it and build bridges. So what I was in my pushback with Shine, what I was trying to do was kind of build a bridge between what the point that she was trying to make, which is that a dividing line in the industry is harmful to everyone, and where I felt like listeners were probably coming from, which was could be thinking that porn inherently is problematic or degrading, and trying to kind of bridge between her and where a listener may be. So that is Shine. The next example I'd like to talk about is from a conversation about stillbirth. So this was a show that we did last year, and we had 3 different guests on who each had different experiences with pregnancy loss. And we were trying to have this conversation in a way that gave them an opportunity to share their experiences and talk about a topic that is not often talked about, but also going in knowing that it's extremely sensitive. It's an extremely sensitive topic. It can be extremely uncomfortable. It can be potentially re-traumatizing for people who have had the experience to listen to the conversation, re-traumatizing for people who've had the experience to tell their story. So what's uncomfortable about this is all of those things, is the sensitivity, is the stakes, is the potential ways it could go wrong and we could do harm. So what that meant for me and our team in our approach meant that sourcing was extremely important. Finding the right guests, finding people who have thoughts about grief and of their experience, but they're not overly practiced or rehearsed in how they tell their story. There's still curiosity there. There's still things that they want to explore, but it's not traumatizing for them to talk about it. It's something that they find some healing through processing. So finding guests who fit that. So that takes a lot of research and prep and talking to people. And then in terms of my role as an interviewer, really making sure that my frame was not trying to make them feel better, was not trying to be overly expressive of my own emotions, but was really to just hold space so that I wasn't trying to make it seem like I wanted the pain to go away or I wanted to solve anything for them. I just wanted to kind of bear witness to this experience and give them a platform. So I will play a clip of this interview, and you can be jotting in the Padlet as we're talking, as things are coming up.
So Andrea, I'd love to start where we left off, talking about the physical body. And Erica mentioned, you go through this process and you don't come home with a baby, but your body physically is still recovering from the childbirth, and there's still these physical manifestations of the pregnancy. So could you talk to me a bit about that and what it's like to experience that physically?
Honestly, that was one of the hardest parts. When you come home without a baby and you've delivered a baby anyway, your milk comes in, and it is incredibly painful. And when you're sent home with other things, you tend to get pain medication or, interventions. I broke my foot last year and they put me in a walking boot or whatever. And I got a little knee scooter and there was, stuff to do. And for engorgement, there was nothing to do. You just had to you could take Tylenol, but everything hurt. I told my family, I said, I'm really sorry, but the air around me hurts. And it just felt so unfair. And then there was the rush of hormones, because one of the things that's wonderful about breastfeeding is that your body takes care of the need to be able to get up at 2:00 in the morning for a year. And so you are just absolutely driven by hormones to do this job. And unfortunately, even if there's no baby, you still have the urge to feed a baby. So there was pain in my body, and I was plagued with dreams. I had waking dreams and sleeping dreams of people dropping babies off for me to nourish. And that part felt really unfair. Like I'd been through enough. I lost my kid, and my body is really not behaving right now, because what I really need is for everything just to pause and to realize that there's no imperative to follow here. But that was not my experience, and it was truly devastating.
Okay. So feel free to take a second to jot some notes about that one. And one other thing that I'll add I'm thinking about as I'm listening back is vocal presence. So this is one of the things that I've honestly found so difficult, is that one of the things that you're really trained to do as a live radio host, that I think podcasts have been amazing for unlearning, is to be pretty silent, to not insert yourself with ums and ahas, but just really let people talk. And for me, I understand the value of that to a point, to not clutter the sound, but to a degree, at a certain point, that starts to feel really inhuman and really unnatural. So one of the things that I have tried to give myself permission to do as a host is to bring my humanity onto the air, or to behind the microphone. And I think that's something that's really important as a podcaster or an interviewer, is to bring your humanity with you into the room. So there were moments in there where I was moved to affirm what she was saying in some way or another, especially because I couldn't see her. This was an interview that was done over, she was in another studio, and I was there to let her know that, like, I'm here, I am present, I'm with you in your telling of this story. So I want to encourage y'all to think about where your own humanity can show up in the interview, and how to give yourself space for that, in a way that doesn't take over, in a way that leaves space for them to tell their story, but is true to you and is true to the kind of humanity you want to bring into the interview. So I have one more example that I want to share, and then we're going to go to breakout rooms for a couple of minutes, and talk through some of these questions about what struck you and what worked well and what didn't. And then we'll come back and I'll answer any questions, and we can talk through some of the examples. Whoops, it's not Padlet time, it's this time. Okay, so the last example I have for you is from a conversation that we had about disability and sexuality. So this is attorney and activist Ariella Barker. She is an attorney in New York City, was crowned Miss Wheelchair North Carolina in 2014, so had some North Carolina roots. And the inspiration for this show came from this really long, in-depth feature piece that I read in the New York Times about how online dating was really changing the landscape for folks with disabilities. And I was really curious to hear more from folks dating with disabilities about the online landscape and how they navigate that, that space, how it makes dating easier and more difficult in various ways. And this was one of the most challenging shows to source for and to prep for as a team, because we were very, very sensitive to the kind of voyeurism inherent in some conversations about disability, that kind of come from the assumption that anyone has a right to understand and to know in-depth details of how someone else lives, and especially to ask questions in a way that kind of assumes inherent difference, and makes assumptions about sexuality, and is very ableistic in its approach. So we had a lot of conversations with our guests beforehand about what they thought the frame should be, what they wanted to center in their own experience, in their own storytelling. And one of the things that we really heard from a lot of them was that they felt like there were so many lessons that folks who weren't in differently abled bodies could learn about consent and navigating consent in sexual relationships, that they feel like they had really practiced because of the ways in which they had to talk to people about how to treat their body. So that was one of the things that we really tried to center in the conversation, was kind of giving a platform for them to model how having a differently able body had allowed them to navigate conversations of consent and how their bodies change over time, in a way that they thought folks could really learn from. So that's an example of kind of co-creating a conversation in a relationship with a guest to see where they felt like the most interesting aspects were, where their curiosity really was in the moment. So here is a bit of that conversation with Ariella.
So we've been talking about communication and how to communicate in various stages of the relationships. And I'd love to know for you, what are the kinds of conversations that you want to have about your physical disability early on a first date, if any at all?
When I was younger, I wanted to avoid the conversation altogether. I didn't want to talk about my disability. I felt like that was pointing out my defect, because that's the way that others looked at it. And so I felt like if I brought it up and made it a subject of conversation, then it would make the other person feel as though it was a bigger issue than it was. And that also came into play with internet dating. I felt as though
if my profile picture showed my wheelchair, well, then that would immediately turn them off. They wouldn't want to date me. Should I include it in the profile? Because I didn't necessarily feel as though it defined me. But later on, as I had one horrible experience after the next, or one traumatizing experience after the next, I realized that I wanted to have that conversation as soon as possible, for nothing other than to weed out potential heartbreak, and also to better prepare that person for what lies ahead, including what judgment or bad advice they might receive from others whenever we could potentially become serious, including their mothers, because mothers always hate me. And for primarily, this assumption that I couldn't have children.
And Julianne, I mean, there are so many assumptions that can be made both early on, but as well as even kind of once you are in a relationship, based on how people experience the way that your body moves or reacts to them. And when you're in relationship with folks, you have to navigate that in a very particular way. I know that you experienced that with kind of physical communication being misread in relationships because of your disability.
Yes, that would happen on a regular basis because I have a spastic cerebral palsy, which means my body tenses on its own without me meaning to tense. So while that is a nonverbal communication of stop, you're making me uncomfortable, for partners who would know my body, they would just assume, oh, that's nothing to pay attention to. She has cerebral palsy. That's just happening. So even a very attentive partner who cares about me and my comfort level, I would have to physically say, I'm really uncomfortable. You need to stop. That's hurting. That's why I'm tense. Please don't do that. So I feel like I've had to learn to be very verbal when it comes to intimacy with partners.
Welcome back. So we have about I guess we have about 7 minutes left. So I want to make time for some Q&A as well as any reflections that y'all had from those breakout rooms. So does anyone have any thoughts from the breakout rooms they want to share, or a link between something that happened in the breakout room and a question you might have that you want us to chat about?
Good question.
Yeah.
So if the interviewee has articulated their discomfort with going in a certain space, how would you? I have trouble just as a person with mild autism discovering people's boundaries. It takes me like a little bit of personal research with their experience with the person before I can figure that out. When they articulate things, it's helpful for me. But how do you respect their wishes, but by the same token, if you're driven by curiosity about what they want to, what you want to know about them,
it's very challenging. So some of it comes with prep work beforehand. So either a producer or someone getting to know what's really off limits, areas that they don't want to go to, and if we feel like we can respect that boundary and still be in line with the conversation that we want to have on the show, then making that decision and going into the conversation with the knowledge that we're not going to go there because that's a boundary we're okay respecting. So for some people, that means offering them anonymity. For some people, it means using a pseudonym for a first name. For some people, it means getting a voice memo from them ahead of time instead of having them as part of the live conversation. So first is like, what is the boundary that they want to set? And then understanding why. Is it a safety reason? Is it discomfort with the topic? Is there another way we can make it more comfortable for them? Is there any accommodation that we can do? If there isn't, and it's something that we feel like we can still proceed with our show and do that. If it's not, then just parting ways, essentially. So I try to always start with accommodation to the best of my ability, whether that's, anonymity, a different way to join, pre-recording instead of doing something live, so they have the opportunity to be a little bit more comfortable, feel a little bit less on edge. So those are some of the strategies that I use. I know different podcasters do it differently. Some people say to people afterward, if there's anything that we talked about while we were on the recording that you don't want me to use in the show, you can tell me afterward and I won't include that as part of my edit. Some people do that. Some people say, I just want you to know beforehand, as soon as a recorder turns on, like I consider this all like a part of the interview experience. So I know the Kitchen Sisters, who are like old school NPR people, they will walk in, they start recording every conversation before they're even inside someone's house or wherever they're going to interview, because they like the sound of that intro, the setup. And so they'll give people that warning ahead of time. So I think a lot of it is setting the table appropriately, letting people know what your expectations are and what they're coming into the process, acknowledging and accepting, and then figuring out, working with boundaries and accommodation after that.
So how do you handle that? Do you have people contact you after an interview and say, I was so embarrassed, please take out that section? How do you handle that?
So if it's live, which a lot of our conversations are, it's a little bit, it's already gone out on the air. It's a little bit too late. So there isn't really a ton that we can do. If it's a pre-recorded interview, we will usually say, we won't, I'm trying to think of an example. I've never had the example where someone said, I don't want this whole thing to air. They usually want to cut a piece of it. And if I feel like that piece could be cut, and it wouldn't lose any integrity, the interview wouldn't lose any integrity and the content wouldn't be changed, we basically take it on a case by case basis. Sometimes we will, other times we'll say ethically, we don't feel like we can do that. So either the interview can't air at all or it can air in its full form.
Ever had people ask to review it before you air, and how do you handle that?
We have, and I don't let people do that. It just opens so many cans of worms that, it's a very hard precedent to set, and you really lose any kind of editorial control. So I try to be really clear that once this interview has been granted or given, that is permission.
Will you share the uncut, unedited interview with the source after it's aired?
If they want to keep it for their own.
Yeah, the original. Yeah. After it's,
yeah.
That's right. That's a convention that they have in Europe that's a little more controversial in the United States, but the sources get the full unedited transcript or interview.
Yeah, I have done that. My experience at StoryCorps, it was very centered on because we both have something to gain from this conversation or from this experience. So that's still kind of how I approach it, is if you're doing this because this is an experience you want to have, then why wouldn't I share the audio with you if that's something that you want?
Well, I can ask a question. What would be the benefit to not pre-interviewing the guest yourself?
Yes.
I think it's much easier to build rapport and find out if I can speak to them as I would on air before. So I know you might not have the time to do that, but I'm just wondering why you said that.
So the reason why I try to not do that is because it's really hard for people to remember what they've said in this conversation versus what they've said before, or to not assume you already know something. So either tell it to you in less detail or kind of rush over things because they're like, oh, they already know this. So whether they're thinking in real time that they already know this, there's kind of, unconscious assumptions and ways that we change our storytelling styles when we're talking to someone who we know is familiar with our experience versus someone who isn't. So I've noticed people leave out details or things sound rehearsed, and there's less opportunity for genuine curiosity and surprise, because what happens in a pre-interview is different than what happens when I'm talking to someone, even if they've gone through some of those basic details.
That's so funny, because I used to do that all the time, and then I'd be sitting there interviewing them and be like, wait, you said that when I pre-interviewed.
Yes.
You say that. So thank you for unraveling that for me.
Yeah, of course.
I had a question about your choice of questions to ask Shine when you were doing that interview. And you knew going into the interview that ethical pornography, the term, would just, put her on the soapbox. And so I'm curious, I was kind of expecting you to just say, so why does this term bother you? But you just went ahead and put that term out there and let her get on the soapbox. And I was wondering why you did that as opposed to the other direction that I thought you'd go in.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that was mostly because of where that happened in the place of the full hour. So we were about 15 minutes into the show and the term ethical pornography had already come up a lot, but there hadn't really been any definition of it or full explanation of it. And so I was worried that if I started with assuming that I knew or everyone knew her thoughts on it, she wouldn't explain enough about what it was to have enough appropriate context for people to follow along when she described why she didn't like it. So that was the reasoning for that. I think if we'd started her earlier in the show, I wouldn't have done it that way. Or if I'd been able to go more deeply into that with someone else beforehand and they would have enough context, I wouldn't have done it that way.
So I think we have to wrap up this session, but this has been such a great conversation. I really enjoyed seeing everyone's thoughts and stuff in the Padlet. And thank you so much, Anita. This has been a really great presentation. Awesome. And maybe, Anita, you could drop any information, people could contact you, socials, anything like that, to continue the conversation.